Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Health Detective Podcast by Functional Diagnostic Nutrition. My name is Evan Transu, aka Detective Ev, and I will be your co-host for today's show. And I say co-host because we have none other than Lucy McKellar with us today for Lunch and Learn number 4. And for the fourth topic, remember, we're starting off, this is going to be a long series, right? As long as they keep Lucy and I around. So we have to start out with some of the more foundational topics and concepts at FDN and what we teach, because, I mean, this is a huge course. You know, even if we tried to do the whole course on lives, it would take, I mean, if you only did like an hour, that would probably take multiple years. If you only did like an hour a week, that's insane. So
it would take a long time. Yeah.
So you'd be here for a while. So we're trying to break these down as simple as possible while also not completely replicating the course, because you do have to pay to get into that. So with that said, today we wanted to talk about what diet FDN teaches its practitioners. I think this is a huge area of concern for a lot of people, because when you're in this space of natural and functional medicine, people can become very in love with their dietary theories. And so we don't want to be hiding what we're into and not into, and we're not apologetic about what we're into and not into. You can choose to do what you like, and we will choose to do what we like, and we actually find ourselves to be overall very neutral. And so I think you guys can appreciate that. But people will ask us sometimes like, hey, I'm vegan, man. Did you guys teach veganism? Because I can't take a course that doesn't do that. Or similarly, hey, I'm into the carnivore keto thing. I won't do a course that doesn't teach that. Are you guys teaching that? And so we'll talk about those things today. We'll also break down kind of a concept that will be talked about more in a later episode, but we'll talk about why bad food's bad for everyone and good food is only good for some people. And this is where the testing and the thinking comes in as FDN practitioners, because we'll never just give out some diet generically. There's always going to be some nuance into what makes a good food good for one person and maybe not good for another individual. Again, bad foods are always bad, but good foods are only good for some people. So Lucy, welcome back to another Lunch and Learn. It's good to have you.
Good to be back. So nice to be here. It's been a while. It's been a minute, couple of weeks.
Yeah, it has been. I'm glad we got back in the swing of things. It was a little crazy here in a good way for the last couple of weeks.
Been very busy.
Yes. With that said, if you are tuning into Lunch and Learn for the first time, because it's only our fourth one, remember, these are shorter and sweeter, 30 minutes or less typically. If you guys have questions, we're happy to answer them, and we might stay a little bit longer, but we actually have hard stops on the hour anyway. So here we go. Lucy, I'll throw it to you first in this sense to just get the elephant in the room addressed here. People are always wondering, okay, is it vegan here? Is it carnivore? Is it paleo? Is it keto? What does FDN teach? I need to know before I go through a course like this. So if you had to say what quote unquote diet do we teach, what are we teaching at FDN?
Ooh, so I would say we actually don't teach any specific diet just to complicate things. We definitely stick to more kind of like an ancestral diet. So we do recommend animal products. They have a lot of healing properties, especially when it comes to healing the gut and things like that. So that is part of what we recommend. But on the whole, we kind of focus on a whole foods approach, which basically means, does the food look like a food, essentially? So we encourage people to avoid junk food, so processed food, anything that kind of comes in a package or a can. If you look at a jar of something and you don't understand the ingredients, we would probably say that that is something that you should avoid while you're going through the healing process. And really try and listen to your body. And I think that's really, the whole listening to your body thing is a really important part of why at FDN we really encourage you to take food sensitivity testing. So we teach the MRT at FDN. And going through that process and understanding how your body is reacting to certain foods really dials you in with how to listen to your body, like what feels good when you eat it and what doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. And so just to be clear, guys, when we say that we do focused on animal based, I know when we go through the course, I think Reed loosely says perhaps, maybe like 3, 4, 5% of the population will come up on metabolic typing in such a way that it might be more of a vegetarian recommendation. Frankly, I've never actually even worked with a client where I've seen that. And I mean, the odds are only, 5% that I'm actually going to get that. So that makes sense. But with that said, we're generally not recommending that. There's a lot of different reasons for it. And this is coming from someone, by the way, just so people don't get too mad here. This is coming from someone who actually tried vegetarianism and even veganism at one point, because I didn't care about any dogma or lack thereof around the diet. I wanted to get well. That's all I cared about. So I did the things that I thought would lead me to good health. And unfortunately, I did not find it in those things. And you mentioned ancestral diets. And so we do talk about something called metabolic typing here. That isn't nearly as I don't think people are as aware of that as they are of like Weston A. Price. I think a lot of people may have heard of that. And so metabolic typing kind of plays off the discoveries of Weston A. Price in a much more complicated and useful way. And what we always have to remember, we can't deny the evidence behind this. When Weston A. Price went out and it visited these indigenous tribes, the fact of the matter is there was only one that ate vegetarian. There was no vegans. They only one ate vegetarian. And interestingly, and you have to remember, and for you guys don't know Weston A. Price, I'm sorry, I shouldn't assume everyone does. He was a vegan, or wanted to be a vegan dentist that was trying to prove veganism. And this was in a time where if you got proven wrong with your research, you actually shared the new findings and didn't just hide it so that you can continue to promote your own theory and hypothesis. Side
Right.
note. And so Weston A. Price came back and said, oh my gosh, not only were they not vegan, every single tribe he visited all throughout the world, from Nunavut, Canada, to different places in Africa, to different places in Costa Rica, he found that they all ate raw animal products. That was actually the only thing that they had in common. So even the vegetarians were eating raw milk, raw cheese. Everywhere else, it was raw organs, raw liver, raw intestine, raw brain. And I know that sounds maybe far out to people in today's world, but that's what he discovered. And the indigenous tribes weren't calling each other on cell phones and WhatsApp and saying, hey, I think you should try out this intestine thing. It's going pretty well for us. This is what original intuitive eating led to. Even more fascinating is that the muscle meats were given to the animals, like the dogs. So it's actually still different than even a lot of the paleo camp of today's world, where it's more muscle meat based. This was more organ based. So isn't that kind of crazy how that's what was going on all these years ago, and now there's all these different like dogmatic diets that actually none of them really fully promote that. Yes, I know carnivore is kind of trying to, but even carnivore is not fully lined up with how these ancestors were living.
No, yeah, you're right. And I think even sort of more like meat-based diets that do tend to recommend like organ meat and stuff is still not as much as what you're talking about. But it's interesting, sorry, just to go back a little bit. I didn't realize that you tried being vegan. That's really interesting because I tried it as well. I tried it for 2 years and I had a terrible reaction to it. And actually that's part of what led me to find FDN. So
Yeah.
it's interesting. Similar paths.
I'll always be transparent. I was pseudo vegan in the sense that for the 9 months that I did it, I was always eating high quality food. Everyone will always say, well, you didn't do it right. No, I did it right. I was eating super high quality food, wasn't eating processed stuff at all. I was more dedicated to the diet stuff then than I am now, just because I had to be, because my health was in such bad shape. And when I say pseudo vegan, I mean, I think I had steak 3 times throughout the 9 months, and I had eggs maybe once a week. So it was like a very weak vegetarian a lot of the time. And what happened is I started breaking stuff for the first time in my life. And I don't mean breaking like objects, I mean breaking myself. I had always been involved, not in like high level sports, but like I always did something intramural. I did basketball, baseball, rugby, lacrosse. Like I did everything, just not at a high level. And I was still playing drop in basketball at the YMCA when I was this age, trying the vegetarian vegan thing. And in like a 6 month span, so I went from, again, I never broke a bone before this in my life, to a snapped ligament, completely snapped. I never got the surgery for it because I didn't want to, because it doesn't limit my range of motion that much. Snapped the ligament completely, shattered my foot, couldn't run for almost 2 years after that because of the injuries. And yes, of course, there was physical activity required to even cause those injuries. I get that, because one could argue that, well, if you didn't do that stuff, this wouldn't have happened. Fair enough. I just find it awfully coincidental that I was able to survive up until that point with 0 injuries. And then in a 6 month span, 2 of the biggest injuries in my life happened. So I couldn't deny those things. What happened to you? You said you weren't doing so well. Like, what ended up happening when you tried it?
Yeah, so I decided to give veganism a try because of health reasons, and also I wanted to save the planet, and I felt like that was a better choice for the planet at the time. This is a while ago. So I ended up being vegan for 2 years, but I was like legit And it wasn't like I wasn't eating like processed foods and things, you get like the Impossible Burger and things like that. I was pretty into making sure, I made my own like black bean burgers and everything. So I was still very committed to like eating real whole foods, but it just didn't work for me. My mental health really tanked. It got really, really bad. The worst it had been in about 6 years. I had really bad back knee. I was getting like spots all over my back, no matter what I did. I thought it was exercise at first. So I kept trying out different things there, trying to tailor what I was doing. And a friend said to me, she was like, it's because you're not eating any meat. You need to start, this is your body crying out to you, and you need to start adding animal products back in. So that was kind of the start of my journey. And I began to look into it. And for me personally, that was definitely the right choice to make, because as soon as I began to incorporate animal products again and began my healing process, things like that, my mental health got better. I was less anxious in the mornings. The back knee disappeared, thank goodness, because that was the worst.
Yeah, and just to be clear, guys, we're not here to, because I kind of phrased that question inappropriately. We're not here to bash veganism. We're here to
Yeah,
talk about the diets that FDN does and doesn't teach.
yeah,
And so we're not against that. There
no,
are very few FDNs who are vegan, like very few, probably
awesome.
less than 1% of graduates, if I had to
Yeah,
guess. So it's not very common here, and it's not by choice. So I still always say, God bless the people that are doing this, because a lot of them are doing it, like you talked about, with their heart in the right place. I loved the idea at the time that I could be healthy without damaging animals or killing animals. I thought that was great. And then the truth of the matter is, it's kind of not to be so dark and pessimistic here, but the reality is, if you're living in today's world, we're kind of subject to a reality where something must die for something else to live. It's kind of crazy if you think about it, that's what
yeah,
we're subjected to. So I think a Native American type of approach is one that I love and helps me. It's a gratitude for everything that you are taking from this earth and making use of the thing. Like, they would use the fur, they would use the bones, whatever. And some people will still say, hey, they killed animals. That's insane. Fine, I get that. But if you're going to do that, I would imagine that that's probably the best way to do it. And I always wonder, do vegans not mow their lawns or drive cars? Because I kill animals, unfortunately, all the time doing those activities.
I mean, that we could get into a whole other conversation about that, but that is a kind of a regular, recurring topic that comes up when, so my sister is vegan. It works very well for her. But we have that conversation kind of regularly. So yeah, it's funny that you bring that up, because I thought maybe it was just me thinking about that, but obviously not.
Yeah, and I forget if it was Alan Watts or Carl Sagan. I feel like it was Alan Watts. He might have said something along the lines of, he acknowledged that all things have to die for something else to live, but he said, I'm paraphrasing this, but the quote's accurate enough. It was like, tomatoes scream quieter than cows. And it's like, all right, I mean, okay, fair enough. So the argument really is doing the least amount of harm, is what they're
Yeah,
trying to say, I suppose. But
yeah,
either way, there's not a lot of evidence that works. And we try to go based on things that have evidence. Then on another side to this dietary conversation is, FDN practitioners are taught to think. We're taught to think on the context of the times. We're taught to think on the context of the person that we're working with. And we have to remember that there's unique things going on in today's world that were not necessarily happening 1,000 years ago. For example, we have a listener base all over the world. I was actually just checking our YouTube stats the other day. This one was crazy to me and so cool. It's only like 40 to 50% of our viewers are in the United States for the YouTube. So we got people UK, Australia, Canada, Switzerland recently. We see you guys, and thank you for listening.
that's
Uh,
awesome.
but, especially in America where it's highly toxic, plants absorb toxins, they absorb heavy metals. So regardless of whether or not I would personally go this extreme with it, and I actually haven't, when you see people on carnivore, a vegan has to be able to acknowledge this. When you see people on carnivore saying, hey, I'm 3 months in and I feel amazing, they're not stupid. That's not placebo. They look completely different, they feel good, whatever. Now, I don't necessarily think that's a long-term thing. I'm not arguing for that. I'm just saying, why do they feel good for any amount of time doing it? Well, again, these plant materials hold on to toxins better. There's glyphosate everywhere in America. There are heavy metals everywhere in America. All the plants, even if they're organic, grown in an organic garden, they're still picking up this stuff from the rainwater and the air, because just because you have an organic farm back here, maybe my neighbor doesn't have that. Right. And so all this stuff still mixes in. So there's the contextual side of this where we might say, okay, who knows? 1,000 years ago, you might have been able to get away with this. But in today's world, where we're more stressed than ever before, our sleep is worse than ever before, and thus leads to a decreased enhanced ability to detoxify. And then we're going to add more toxins in because these organic, otherwise great plants are now not getting the nutrients that they need. So they're less nutrient dense and they have more toxins in them. That could be a reason too why some of this stuff is not as beneficial. So, you know what I mean, Lucy? Like, you have to think about the context of these things, and plants today are not the same as plants 200 years ago.
No, you're completely right. And also, the continual use of the soil also decreases the amount of nutrients that the plants can actually get. And I mean, you can talk about that as well for factory farming of animals, which I mean, a whole different point. But the food, the plants in this example, it is taking up from the soil, it's not there, so it's not getting the nutrients and the vitamins and minerals that we need when we are just consuming a plant-based diet.
Mhm.
And I think, and again, I mean, kind of on a tangent here, but that's a part of the reason why at FDN we talk about supplementation and things like that, because you're right, it's not 200 years ago. There's not as many nutrients because of the way that we're farming. So that has a big impact as well, because I think oftentimes we think, oh, I'm eating spinach. This is, really healthy and good for me. But it's not the spinach that it would have been 50 years ago when, we had much better quality soil, when it wasn't consistently being used over and over and over without a break, and making sure that it has the correct nutrients in the soil.
Right. In terms of what we do teach and how we address this with each client or practitioner that goes through the program, because Lucy's diet's not going to be identical to Ev's, there's a couple categories that we use. So we're using something called metabolic typing. I already referenced that. Metabolic typing is rooted in Weston A. Price types of teachings. It's again, it's much more nuanced and complicated than that, but it is rooted in that. So you kind of learn, you can almost call it food combining, food pairing. You learn about how certain things can do a little bit better together, which I found fascinating because it does work for me. I still do it to this day. And then we also look at things like food sensitivities. That goes back to this idea of bad foods are bad for everyone, but good foods only might be good for some people. For an easy example, an avocado would generally be considered probably a pretty good food. That'd be good for the vegans. It'd be good for the keto people. It'd be good for the paleo. Like, everyone could win with an avocado. However, let's say I'm allergic to an avocado that gives me anaphylaxis. Well, would you still argue that avocado is a good food for me? No, of course not. It's a terrible food for me. It could kill me, right? And thankfully, I'm not allergic to avocados. But I'm just saying, if you're allergic to a food that's otherwise generally considered healthy, that's when it would be a bad food for the individual. So we need to measure that stuff and figure it out. So we look at things like food sensitivities. And then a whole third category, which is a massive one, would be things like, okay, does this individual have a fungal overgrowth? Does this individual have a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth? Because now we might have to temporarily, not forever, but temporarily be more restrictive or specific about what the person is consuming while they're on this healing journey. So, do you think I missed anything there? The metabolic typing, food sensitivity side, and then the bacterial and fungal side, I think that matters. But is there any other ways that we're thinking about how this person might have to adjust their dietary needs?
No, I think that's off the top of my head. I feel like that's fairly accurate. Yeah, I mean, someone might have to tailor slightly, not necessarily if they're dealing with SIBO or Candida, but if they're doing like a gut healing protocol, they might have to tailor slightly towards if you eat meat, like slow cooked meats, lots of bone broth, things like that. But again, it's not, it doesn't have to be like a permanent diet change. It can be for a period of time while you're going through that healing process.
Mhm. One of the things that Reed recommends in the course too, and I mean, I don't know if people are actually this strict with it always, but when you were working with Reed back in the day, this is how you did it.
Oh, I
He,
bet.
he wouldn't even take on clients if you weren't willing to say, I'm going to go gluten, dairy, sugar, and alcohol free for the first 90 days of this. If you weren't willing to do that, he won't take your money to run these labs and do this stuff. He won't even take your money, won't even bother, because he believed that you needed to at least try that for 90 days to give your body a break, right? Did you actually, I hate to put you on the spot with this, but did you actually do that for a full 90 days at any point?
I did it for 5 months.
Nice.
I did 5.5 months, gluten free. I think sugar, I did 90 days. Didn't have any alcohol, cut out dairy. Um, yeah, that was, yeah. So I actually went for it because I was like, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to actually do this.
Nice. So you incorporate gluten again?
I am okay with like sourdough.
Oh, interesting. Okay, yeah, because I've been about 7 years intentional gluten-free, and when I say intentional, I mean, who knows if I got cross-contaminated accidentally, but
Yeah.
actively making a choice and trying. And 8 years struggling because this was before I knew that a small dose of gluten dose can give you a big immune response for many months. So, like, I was doing it every, like, 2 weeks thinking that I'm gluten-free and not realizing, "Oh my gosh, this was not pointless, but still very dumb." The dairy one I incorporated recently, like last year, and that seems to be going overall well because I'm eating much different dairy than before. Sugar, that completely depends on my activity level and stuff like that. And alcohol, I was never, thankfully, very big on alcohol. Anyway, I've probably had 2 or 3 glasses of wine in the last 2 years. I'm not very fun.
Yeah. So I do drink, but it's not, I mean, not as little as that, but it's probably once every couple of weeks. And I'll have like one or two of like glasses of wine. But yeah, apart from that, my Achilles heel is chocolate.
Oh yeah.
But I make better choices with that. So I try and stick to Hue chocolate, which if you're not from the States or maybe you haven't heard of it, it's good ingredients. It's how chocolate should be essentially. It's dark chocolate and it's made without fillers and emulsifiers and oils and things like that. So it's a good one if you're looking for a slightly better take on chocolate.
Mhm.
But again, obviously, it's something I try and be sparing with. But yeah, that tends to be my Achilles heel. And I'm actually okay with dairy as well, but I do try and stick to raw dairy, although I can't do milk. I've never liked milk, and I even as a child I was never into milk. But yeah, apart from like cheese, I try and stick to raw cheese.
Yeah, I
Raw.
do. I hate putting all the labels on it, especially if I have to look my dad in the eyes and he hears this crap and he's like, "What are you saying?" I'll be like, "Yeah, Dad, it's raw grass-fed double A2 milk," and he's like, "Really? Like we could have just have like a normal gallon of milk?" But no, that I do that, and that works very well for me, and that feels good. And I
Raw
don't even want to talk about how much milk I started drinking again once I realized I could handle it. But I'm very active, man. Like I'm always doing stuff, and so I need the calories, and that liquid is just much easier. Anyway,
I
anyway.
mean, if it works for you, and I think that's an important point to note. Like FDN is individual to each person, and we
Yes.
encourage that. So
So, if we were working with someone like Lucy, I'll make you the pseudo client here for a second, so we can kind of walk people through because they might want. I know people, are, especially with dietary stuff, they're going to want specifics. Like, how do I specifically figure out what I need to eat? And it's like, well, the truth of the matter is, unless you go through a full system like this, doesn't have to be with us, but if you don't go through a full system like this, you're not going to have the same specificity, right? That's why when you read these dietary books and they have general recommendations, of course it's going to work for some people and it's not going to work for
right.
others. You're basically flipping a coin and hoping for the best, and it might be a lopsided coin because the chances are that I don't even think it's 50-50 it works for people. It's more like 25 it works for than 75 it doesn't work for.
Yeah.
With Lucy, when you're going through FDN, what we're doing first is we're looking at that metabolic typing test. Do you remember if you came back as a slow oxidizer, mixed, or fast offhand?
I was mixed. I've actually just redone it and I'm waiting for the test, but
Okay.
originally I was mixed.
So I was mixed as well. So in terms of flexibility of the diet, Lucy and I are at a notable advantage there. We can actually mix in carbs, fats, and proteins pretty evenly. My wife Maddie is a fast oxidizer, and it's crazy because you can like people are not completely disconnected from their intuition yet. Like Maddie came to me, this beautiful girl, like you think like she's so innocent, and then she's like, "All right, give me the huge steak, and I want it rare." Like that's what she's getting for dinner. I'm like, okay. And then she finally goes through the metabolic typing stuff a year later, and we find out, sure enough, she's a fast oxidizer, and they do much better on those higher protein, higher fat diets. They do a lot better on like the keto stuff, and she does fantastic on it. It's like she's the person that you can see, even if it was organic, super healthy carbohydrates, if she eats like 40, 50 grams of carbs, especially if it was not around exercise, she just tanks. Like the mood
Right.
tanks, the energy tanks, she's ready for a nap, whatever. Whereas for me and Lucy, when you're a mixed oxidizer, you have to be kind of careful about when you schedule, if you will, these foods into your life. But I've noticed for me personally, if I start the day off with moderate protein, higher fat, I'm very good for the day. And then my carbohydrates, I'll either limit to around activity or honestly a bit later in the day, not too late because I don't really try to eat after dark, but I'm talking like 5 or 6 p.m. I might have actually a more carbohydrate rich meal, and that seems to do well for me. How do you break that down similarly, or is it a little bit different for you?
Pretty similar. I stick mostly to proteins and fats at breakfast. I tend, if I have like, if I'll do, so I'll eat like gluten-free toast or something, and I will crash if I try and do like eggs and gluten-free toast. It just doesn't work for me. And like you, I have to limit the amount that I'm having. And I find, so I will eat after it gets dark. If, you know, life happens, I eat later, that's fine. But I will, if I'm having like a later dinner, I absolutely have to limit the amount of carbs that I'm having with dinner. Otherwise, I'll be wired, I won't sleep very well, and
That's
I'll wake
interesting.
up feeling like crap the next day.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. And see, so even though both mixed oxidizers, that's some of the nuance there. Next step, like we talked about, would be the food sensitivity test, the MRT. So for me, oh man, this was years ago that I started this. Spinach was I know you brought that up already, but spinach was a super high one for me. Shrimp was super high. Many grains were very high for me. So the metabolic typing diet might have recommended some of those things for me, like sprouted, good quality grains, but I couldn't do it because I was sensitive to them at the time. It did do chocolate. I don't think I ever took that one out because it wasn't a red sensitivity. I'm chocoholic too. I couldn't do that.
Oh, you are?
Uh, Lucy, I can't even say it on a public podcast. It's disgusting. And if I didn't know subjectively and objectively being the labs that I was still doing well, I would think it's means for concern. I will just say, one of the longest living people ever. I got to get her name because it's easy to find online. She ate like 2.2 pounds of chocolate a week on average, and she lived to like 117 or something. It was
That
crazy.
makes me feel a lot better about my own chocolate
Yep.
consumption.
So you just get that high quality stuff, you're good to go, baby. Live to 117.
Well, I try not to keep it in the house because my problem is if it's there, I'll just keep eating it. So I'll buy like little bits, and then I'm like, okay, I'm good for the week. Otherwise, I'm just like, yes, this is great.
Yeah, no, this is a daily requirement. Most people are addicted to caffeine. Not that there's not some caffeine in dark chocolate, although it's not anywhere near what you're getting in like
Yeah, it's
coffee drinkers and stuff.
inevitable.
But theobromine, I think I'm addicted to that. That's another stimulant in there, and I love that one. That's for sure. Okay. So now we're doing the MRT, right? We're looking at how this person is reacting to certain foods. And we'll do a whole episode on this test, by the way, in the future. But for now, I'll just say some foods are more recommended to be removed for 90 days. And then we try to reincorporate them. Some foods we will see on the test based on the level of the sensitivity. And we'll say, okay, this is something you're probably going to want to take away indefinitely. If you can live without it, maybe you should live without it, that type of stuff. And
Right.
so now we've looked at this metabolic typing. We've seen what macronutrient ratios are good for you, what food pairings are good for you. We're looking at what you're sensitive to. Another thing, I knew I forgot something earlier, and this technically would have been in metabolic typing, but either way, we should mention it. The diet check record sheet. That thing's perfect. This is another way that we self-correct at FDN because, the system's humble enough to know we're not perfect and we're not going to figure everything out. So the diet check record sheet is basically just helping you have an awareness around how you feel after eating certain stuff. Like Lucy, you brought up, okay, you have this eggs and gluten-free toast meal and you crash, right? It sounds obvious, but so many people, guys, maybe even if you're listening to this or watching this, they're not aware of that. They don't understand that, oh, wait, I feel bad 2 hours after this meal every time I eat it. I always just thought I didn't get enough sleep and I'm tired in the morning. Certain meals I realized can sustain me for 6 to 7 hours before I feel hungry again. And I had level headed energy the whole time. So that's where the diet check record sheet comes into it. Helps us I almost look at that as it helps us get back into our intuition and become more aware of what we should have been aware of naturally, right?
Yeah, and actually, I wasn't aware of any of this stuff until I went through FDN. I would absolutely eat like oats for breakfast and
Mhm.
things like that, and then crash. And I would just assume that's normal because that's what we hear, right? We hear fatigue and needing a coffee like 4 times a day is normal. So I was just like, oh, this is just how it is, and I never correlated like how I was feeling back to food until I went through FDN and ran the MRT on myself and came back with like a bunch of random foods that I was eating that I believe were healthy for me, such as turmeric, spinach, all the kind of like superfoods you hear like you should be eating. I couldn't eat. By removing those, it helped me to feel a lot better. So it is a really important test to run.
Yep. And then the final thing here that we will chat about very briefly, just I'm curious what happened to you here because I'm so sorry if this is the wrong person. I think you said that you had Candida overgrowth when you got tested, right? Okay, no, I was right. So that would be something that we have to think about in terms of Lucy's diet temporarily while we're getting her better. So, do you remember like what were some of the unique things that you had to do because of the Candida overgrowth when you were going through it?
Well, I had to give up sugar. So the chocolate was gone. So an easy way for me to remember it was to focus on foods that are above ground versus underground. So anything like, carrots, and well, the exception to that is mushrooms. But they kind of grow in the dirt, so I guess it kind of works. But things like the mushrooms and carrots and anything that's kind of growing underground, potatoes, that can kind of increase Candida. Unfortunately, Candida loves anything kind of yeasty, sugary. It's really going to encourage that Candida overgrowth, which is obviously the opposite of what we want. So another great thing another great reason, sorry, for going through the MRT is, you can look at what foods work within your diet as well. Because just because you have Candida and you stick to a Candida diet doesn't mean that all of those foods are actually going to be right for you. So it's a real tricky balance there.
Yeah. All right. So, and that's just how it works. Guys, this is not overly complicated. It's a little harder to execute when you're first doing it. And it's something that you're going to stumble on and your clients are going to stumble on. But to ask the question that comes up so much, what diet do we teach? We're not teaching one specific diet. We do talk about ancestral eating. We absolutely are of the belief that animal proteins have a place in almost every human being's diet. Even if it's not full out meat, you're still going to need some stuff. And again, that's not really our opinion. I mean, Weston A. Price did travel to these places, and somehow these individuals knew to do this intuitively. Now, you could argue that intuition is not as good as the latest modern science. I don't know that I would agree with that, but that's at least an argument. So we're focusing, though, on intuitive ancestral stuff, and then we're helping you course correct with some of the advances that we have in today's world, like metabolic typing, diet check record sheet. It's not really an advance of today's world, simple, but it works very well. Food sensitivity testing, and then the knowledge around, all right, you have certain overgrowths in your gut or lack thereof. Okay, we need to make sure that we're eating specifically for your gut at this time. So that's what we're teaching at FDN. I'm sorry that if it's not the answer that you guys wanted, maybe some of people wanted us to say, no, it's only this, it's only that. That's not how we do it. We're health detectives. Yes, it's a cute name that we have on the show, but it's also a very real thing. We are health detectives, and detectives have to investigate. They have to look at evidence for each individual scene. And that's what we're doing with our clients. So did I miss anything else, Lucy?
I think you got it.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you guys for tuning in to our fourth Lunch and Learn. These will get very nerdy sometimes. I know this isn't like the most nerdy one today, but we do have to get through, again, some of these foundational or higher level things before we continue to progress through the rest of the FDN curriculum. So, Lucy, thanks so much for being with me again. I love